Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are on listen-only mode for today's conference. During the question and answer sessions, if you'd like to ask your question over the phone line, you may do so by pressing star 1 to enter the question queue. This conference is also being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I'll now turn the conference over to John Thompson. Thank you, and please begin.
Thank you, operator. Hello, everybody. My name is John Thompson. As just mentioned, I am an auditor with the Office of Community Services and the Division of Energy Assistance, also known as DEA. I'm glad everybody could join us for this webinar. It's a little earlier than we're accustomed to starting, and I hope everyone is adjusted on their time zones and locked in and ready to go, because we have a lot of information that we're going to cover today. And we'll be presenting this. I'll be your facilitator for today. And the actual webinar will be run by our ICF support monitoring team. This is the series. This is the second of our webinars that we're giving for this summer, fiscal webinars that is. And as mentioned before, this will cover the expectations and requirements of subgrantee fiscal monitoring, that is. So as you listen to today's presentation, I encourage you all to keep these 4 areas in mind that are mentioned here. Subgrantees or subrecipients are an extension of your team, so they represent you. In the same way that our office performs on-site monitoring to determine compliance with LIHEAP, as states being the non-federal pass-through entity, your agency is required to set and implement a schedule to monitor your subgrantees. Besides the federal requirements, your own rules may require monitoring. However, you must be aware of all the requirements. I want you to also keep in mind compliance. And this is definitely a federal requirement, so think as your agency strives to use LIHEAP funds in accordance to rules and regulations, it's equally important that subgrantees who receive the money are also following the same set of guidelines to expend their funds. We will discuss the statutes and uniform guidance and the other requirements in detail today. Also, third dot is connecting the dots. Effective subgrantee monitoring can sometimes uncover a small issue that could lead to bigger ones uncovered later. Here's an example. If a vendor of a subgrantee is experiencing delays in receiving payments or receiving partial payments, that could be a sign of internal cash flow or reconciliation issues that the subgrantee is experiencing, which could later lead to mismanagement of federal funds. So consider what you're not being told by your local agency sometimes. Also consider how you can get feedback from the partners to confirm the accuracy of what the local agencies are reporting to you. And the last area to consider is training and technical assistance. When performing monitoring, usually areas of improvement are discovered by you, the grantee, that you can see as an opportunity to provide technical assistance and conduct training. You should really consider these because in the end, it will only enhance overall operations. Also, see the need. What we mean by that is, although this webinar will primarily focus on fiscal monitoring, the correlation between program and fiscal runs deep. Here's an example. We've seen in many non-federal agencies that a program department may be in charge of developing a fiscal report like the carryover and reallotment report, and the finance department will be in charge of another fiscal report like the SF425. Both these reports do have common data, and as we've stated before on many of our monitoring visits, a common monitoring finding that we've seen is that these reports do not always reconcile, or the numbers do not tie back to one another. If your respective state teams are not in agreement on this data, then how can we at the federal level have confidence in what is being reported to us? So the same goes true for fiscal monitoring. It's essential that fiscal monitoring reports or joint monitoring results are shared with each area of operation, meaning your fiscal program and your fiscal end program. And if you see the last dot there, you get to choose the next topic. This is something new that we are offering. And so at the end of this webinar, you will be given a list of topics that you'll get to decide through the use of polling. And you'll be able to choose actually our topic for our fourth webinar given in August. So the topics that receive the highest results, we will go ahead and tally those up, and we will reveal those results, and you'll be able to find out what the topic of our fourth webinar is. So hopefully everyone sticks around for the next hour. We have a lot of great content to cover, and you also get a chance to vote on what our next topic is for our fourth webinar coming up in August. So now I'm going to turn it over to the ICF team.
Thanks, John. And hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Chetan Mahajan. I'm with ICF, and we're glad you could join us today for our webinar on subgrantee fiscal monitoring. So the presenters today from the ICF team will be Jason Clevenger, Johanna Barrero, and Audra Thanikari. We've supported the federal LIHEAP program at the Office of Community Services since 2012. So many of you already know us and have worked with us. And as you know, we work closely with the program and fiscal staff at OCS to coordinate and conduct on-site monitoring of LIHEAP grantees. To date, we have visited more than 260 LIHEAP grantees, sub-grantees, and local agencies for monitoring purposes. So today our focus is a discussion about sub-grantee fiscal monitoring. And in the next month or so, we'll have a related discussion about internal controls for effective program and fiscal management. As I also mentioned on our previous webinar, when developing our webinars this year, we had to step back and think that given current operational challenges with COVID-19, how relevant is it to discuss sub-grantee fiscal monitoring? And again, the resounding response from everyone involved was that it's even more relevant now, as monitoring is about accountability and enhancing your LIHEAP program integrity. On our first webinar this year, when we discussed single audit findings, we mentioned that single audits are about public accountability. So simply put, single audits are publicly available records, and single audits hold us accountable for using federal funding in a compliant manner. On this webinar for subgrantee fiscal monitoring, we're addressing accountability again. It's about accountability for compliance and performance. So we're conducting subgrantee monitoring to help ensure that our operations are compliant with relevant rules, regulations, and requirements, and that we're also utilizing LIHEAP funding in the most impactful and efficient manner.
Thanks, Chetan. During today's webinar, we are focusing on subgrantee fiscal monitoring. When we mention the term subgrantee, we are referring to the local offices or local agencies that help you administer your program. You may award subgrants to these local offices, or you may not, but we are using the terms subgrantees, subrecipients, local agencies, and local offices interchangeably. We are also focusing only on the fiscal aspect of subgrantee monitoring, not programmatic. Though there are many overlapping elements with programmatic monitoring, and we want to stress the importance of collaboration between program and fiscal staff in any monitoring process, this webinar is informed by our own work in fiscal monitoring with LIHEAP grantees on behalf of OCS over the past several years. We'll also provide examples that we've compiled from our own monitoring of LIHEAP grantees, and without revealing who those grantees are, we will show some of the areas of non-compliance over subrecipient monitoring. We'll also share some subrecipient monitoring noteworthy practices that we've observed at some of the grantees we've monitored. These examples will help guide our discussions on the importance of effective subgrantee fiscal monitoring, and we'll conclude the webinar with time to answer any questions you may have. Today's webinar, we'd like to focus on 3 primary learning objectives. First, we want to provide you with an overview of what subgrantee fiscal monitoring is and why it's important. Second, We want to provide an overview of the federal requirements for subgrantee fiscal monitoring, including the LIHEAP specific requirements. And finally, we will provide an example framework and considerations for desk reviews and site visits you may conduct with subgrantees. This framework comes from our own monitoring experience, and while your approach will be unique, this information can help provide for a more effective subgrantee fiscal monitoring process. But before we start, we know that there are a lot of challenges with COVID-19 and that it has likely affected your subgrantee monitoring efforts. This uncertain and evolving situation requires us to think about the programmatic aspects such as risk assessments for monitoring, site visits, technology, and cybersecurity. Additionally, some of the challenges that grantees may face in the current environment are a lack of necessary technology and equipment for staff to use to conduct remote monitoring, a lag time for VPN access, not enough teleconferencing licenses, your employees' home Wi-Fi having a low bandwidth, and security of personally identifiable information, or PII. We recommend that you have contingencies and written procedures in place to navigate the challenges due to COVID-19. Doing so may help lessen the impact to your normal operations. And before we launch into the subgrantee monitoring specifics, let's find out how your monitoring has been affected by COVID-19. We have several polls in today's webinar, and for this first one, we ask, as a result of COVID-19, has your agency done or experienced any of the following? A, are you planning on moving planned site visits to desk reviews? B, are you finding challenges with uploading or sending the information or receiving information from subgrantees? C, do you have any PII concerns with electronic submissions? Or D, other, are you experiencing anything else? Please take a few moments to consider these options and type the letter of your response in the chat pod. Okay, it looks like a lot of folks have been rescheduling planned site visits to remote desk reviews. And if you select other, why don't you type in your response, what are some of the other things you've been doing? But it looks like almost everybody has moved planned site visits to remote desk reviews, which is pretty expected. We'll give folks a couple more minutes to type in their response. This is really good information because it helps us learn from you and know how we can support you better. Virtual reviews, rescheduling site reviews, also challenges with uploading information. All right, great. That was great information. Yep, that is great information. That's been very helpful. And it helps us get a better sense of how we can best be of service for you. We got some folks still typing, extending the length of their monitoring, and more switching to remote desk reviews. Okay, great. Thanks so much. We have another poll now, and for this one, we ask, as a result of COVID-19, has your organization explored implementing A, online platforms for document sharing, or B, electronic intake systems with remote access to local agency records? C, if you've done both of these, please select C, and if you've done neither of these, please select D. Okay, we see a lot of folks have done both of these, using online platforms for document sharing, also exploring electronic intake systems. Wow, a lot of C's are popping up. That's great. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just helpful for us to know how things are affecting you. And we know that many of you already conduct remote monitoring, and it's an important part of your day-to-day operations. So it's really interesting to see how you've been navigating the challenges with COVID-19. A lot of participants say they're exploring both these options. Give a couple A few more moments for folks to type in their response. Okay. Looks like that was about everybody. Okay, thank you so much. That's very helpful information to know. Thank you.
Okay, so what is subgrantee fiscal monitoring? Subgrantee fiscal monitoring is a concerted effort to monitor the fiscal controls, administration, and performance of your LIHEAP subgrantees, those local agencies and offices that help you administer LIHEAP. States, tribes, and territories are the prime recipients of LIHEAP grants, and as prime recipients or prime grantees, it is your responsibility to oversee the sub-award process to the entities who administer LIHEAP with you. Subgrantees can be municipal agencies, nonprofit organizations, an agency who you partner with through an interagency agreement to help you run portions of your program, such as the LIHEAP weatherization component, or they may be local offices of a state agency. All of these entities are considered subgrantees. Regardless of how they are comprised or where they are located, if a local agency helps you administer your program, their LIHEAP fiscal performance is your responsibility. Subgrantee fiscal monitoring is important for several reasons. First, it helps you ensure compliance with federal and state LIHEAP policies, procedures, and laws. States, tribes, and territories, the prime recipients of the LIHEAP block grant funds, are responsible for monitoring the fiscal and program performance of their subgrantees. Second, subgrantee fiscal monitoring can improve your ability to collaborate with local agencies and become more aligned as a team administering the program. Subgrantee fiscal monitoring is also an opportunity to nurture your relationships with your local agencies and learn from each other. Engaging subgrantees as partners will help you solve issues and challenges more effectively. Third, fiscal monitoring can be a reliable source of evaluation for your program. Through monitoring, you can identify your program's strengths as well as areas you are challenged with, and you can apply those lessons learned to improve your program. And finally, subgrantee fiscal monitoring can be a way to keep open and transparent communication between program and fiscal staff. Regardless of how you carry out your monitoring, it is essential to have effective two-way communication between program and fiscal staff. This will strengthen your monitoring process and your program.
As monitors of LIHEAP grantees, we noted that inadequate subgrantee monitoring was an issue of noncompliance in 60% of the monitoring site visits we conducted during federal fiscal year 2019. Further, when we analyzed 2018 single audit findings of LIHEAP grantees, subrecipient monitoring was the compliance category which affected the greatest number of grantees. In short, subgrantee fiscal monitoring issues have come up a lot in both monitoring and audits performed on LIHEAP grantees. These issues are a result of grantees not adhering to one or more of the subgrantee monitoring requirements. If these issues are left unaddressed, they could not only lead to governance challenges, but also loss of service delivery for low-income households and public scrutiny. Now let's discuss the requirements and regulations around subgrantee monitoring. The first regulation we want to cover is the United States Department of Health and Human Services regulation for the LIHEAP Block Grant Fund found at Title 45 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, Part 96, Subpart H. Subparts A through F of 45 CFR 96 generally apply to all HHS block grants, including LIHEAP. Subpart H is specific to LIHEAP. We provided links to regulations at the end of the webinar, and you should check them out in their completeness, as it is a lot of information to cover. An important monitoring-related aspect of this regulation is the requirement found in 45 CFR 96.84C, which details preventing waste, fraud, and abuse. It states that grantees must establish appropriate systems and procedures
to prevent, detect, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse in activities funded under LIHEAP. The systems and procedures are to address possible waste, fraud, and abuse by clients, vendors, and administering agencies, for example, your subgrantees. As you think through your monitoring approach, areas that you may want to consider for the prevention of waste, fraud, and abuse include having an implemented written plan to distribute your policies and procedures on preventing, detecting, and reporting cases of waste, fraud, and abuse to your subgrantees and providing training to your subgrantees on these policies and procedures. Federal OMB Uniform Administrative Guidance 2 CFR 200.331D requires grantees to monitor the activities of their subgrantees to ensure that subawards are used for authorized purposes. This means that you should ensure your subgrantees are in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of their subaward, and that subaward performance goals are achieved. This may include reviewing required financial and programmatic reports, and following up and ensuring that subgrantees take timely and appropriate action to resolve all deficiencies detected through audits, site visits, or other types of reviews. There is additional OMB Uniform Administrative Guidance that would be helpful for you to review as it helps to improve the integrity of the financial management and operation of your program and strengthens accountability for federal funds by improving policies that protect against waste, fraud, and abuse. OCS has put out an information memorandum on this, and a link to this guidance is provided at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Audra. Finally, when LIHEAP grantees submit their annual LIHEAP plan to HHS, they certify that they will adhere to the 16 federal LIHEAP statutory assurances. These assurances include requirements for fiscal monitoring and administration of the award. While there are 16 assurances in total, we will highlight 4 that play an important role in your monitoring. So let's start with Assurance 10. But first, keep in mind that LIHEAP grantees must follow their own state, tribal, and territorial policies around monitoring. The federal guidelines are very broad, but Assurance 10 provides that LIHEAP grantees will establish fiscal control and fund accounting procedures as necessary to assure the proper disbursal of and accounting of federal LIHEAP funds. This includes having procedures for monitoring the assistance provided under LIHEAP and providing that grantees will comply with the Single Audit Act. As a reminder about 45 CFR 96.30, you need to apply the same rules and definition for obligating and expending the federal LIHEAP funds as you would for your own state, tribe, or tribal or territorial funds. As you implement these requirements and your own fiscal control and accounting procedures, you must be able to prepare and submit accurate reports for the use of LIHEAP funds. You must also be able to track expenditures of LIHEAP funds to a level of detail that ensures the funds are being used in accordance with all relevant rules and regulations. Another assurance that addresses the need for subgrantee monitoring is Assurance 7. Assurance 7 requires the grantee to notify each participating household of the amount of assistance paid on its behalf, assure that the energy supplier will charge the eligible household the difference between the actual cost of the home energy and the amount of the payment made by the grantee, assure that the energy supplier will provide assurances that any of its agreements contain provisions to assure that no household receiving LIHEAP assistance will be treated adversely because of such assistance, and ensure that the provision of vendor payments remains at the option of the grantee in consultation with local subgrantees and may be contingent on unregulated vendors taking appropriate measures to alleviate the energy burdens of eligible households. Monitoring for Assurance 7 applies to grantees that have subgrantees that pay vendors directly, as it would be primarily through monitoring that detailed reviews and testing of these requirements would be performed. It is good practice for LIHEAP grantees and subgrantees to be on the lookout for major delays between when services are provided and payments are made to the vendor to ensure that vendors are paid in a timely manner. Monitoring for Assurance 7 could also include performing a reconciliation of payments for bulk fuel vendors. This should provide for an end-to-end reconciliation of the LIHEAP benefit payment, including any prepayment to vendors. Monitoring for Assurance 7 could also include reviewing case files to ensure each participating household was notified of the amount of assistance paid on its behalf, and a review of written implemented procedures on how to process vendor refunds. These procedures should be communicated to LIHEAP staff, vendors, and subgrantees, and they should specify how to ensure refunds are adequately tracked such that they may be properly accounted for, and ensuring that vendors return any credit balances to the prime grantee.
Your monitoring approach should ensure that you and your subgrantees are abiding by the administrative cost requirements. LIHEAP grantees determine the terms and conditions for their subgrant awards, which could include the cost principles subgrantees must abide by, and the requirement for subgrantees to provide a cost allocation plan or have an approved indirect cost rate, all of which help to determine allowable admin costs. Assurance 9 of the LIHEAP statute details the percentage limitations on LIHEAP funds being used for planning and administration. States cannot spend more than 10% of their LIHEAP award on planning and admin costs. This includes admin costs at the subgrantee level. States are required to pay for planning and admin costs that exceed 10% of their LIHEAP award with non-federal sources of funding. Grantees may set up a different administrative cost limit for subgrantees. However, the grantee cannot exceed their 10% limit for their state. Tribes and territories have unique regulations on admin costs based on the federal block grant regulations at 45 CFR 96.88b, which states that tribes and territories with awards of $20,000 or less may use up to 20% of their LIHEAP award on planning and admin costs. And tribes and territories with awards over $20,000 may use up to 20% of the first $20,000 of their award amount, plus 10% of their award amount that exceeds $20,000 on planning and admin costs. Effective monitoring for admin cost compliance could include reviewing the coding on invoices so that you will be able to identify funding sources and can determine if local agencies are using other sources of federal funding for admin costs. Also, during monitoring for admin cost compliance, you can discuss admin cost requirements with your local agencies and determine if they have a mechanism in place to report other federal funding used for admin costs. Assurance 16 of the LIHEAP statute states that grantees have the option to use up to 5% of their LIHEAP award to provide services that encourage and enable households to reduce their home energy needs and thereby reducing the need for energy assistance. Direct staff expenses for implementing Assurance 16 activities are allowable, but make sure that you track these expenses separately from the admin costs you charge to LIHEAP. During subgrantee fiscal monitoring, you can discuss with your local agencies how exactly are they using Assurance 16 funding, as well as test Assurance 16 expenses to see if they're in compliance with LIHEAP requirements. Also, if a grantee has outlined Assurance 16 requirements in a subgrantee contract, the grantee can also test contract requirements.
Thanks, Johanna and Audra. Okay, so that was a lot of information, so let's take a breather. We know that's a lot of regulations, and it should show you how it's required to monitor your subgrantees and be responsible for their LIHEAP performance. Hopefully, hearing them all isn't too overwhelming, but it's good to start thinking about compliance as you move forward with your own monitoring activities and approach. Another thing we want to point out is that a solid way to help your compliance efforts is to ensure that you are documenting your monitoring process. Implemented written procedures for subgrantee fiscal monitoring is essential. We've observed time and time again through our own monitoring efforts where LIHEAP grantees did not have their procedures written and documented, and it resulted in an issue of noncompliance. You'll see examples of these in more detail later in the webinar. But now let's take another poll. So for this poll, we ask, when you are conducting fiscal monitoring of your LIHEAP subgrantees, what items do you typically review? A, supporting documents for a sample of client case files and their related benefit payments. B, vendor agreements, vendor payments, and refunds. C, accounting records, such as the general ledger for LIHEAP, bank statements, reconciliation of expenditures to request for reimbursement. D, internal controls, for example, controls that prevent duplicate payments and to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. Or E, all of the above. Please take a few moments to review these choices and type the corresponding letter of your answer into the chat pod. Okay, look at all those E's. Looks like everybody is doing all of the above. That's great to know. Helps us get a better understanding of how robust everybody's monitoring efforts are. We could be 100% on E's almost, which is really great. Give folks a few more moments. Okay, I think we had all E's for that one, so thank you so much. Now, let's take a look at some ideas for your monitoring approach. In this section, we'll cover a general framework and considerations for subgrantee fiscal monitoring. We'll use real examples of noncompliance issues and noteworthy practices that we've observed through our own LIHEAP monitoring efforts. And we'll discuss some considerations for designing your desk review and site visit approaches.
Thank you, Jason. Often when we hear the term monitoring, we think of a one-time or annual event, such as a site visit. However, effective monitoring should be a continuous process. Many of you may already be doing fiscal monitoring as part of your day-to-day work. For example, fiscal monitoring takes place when employees check agency invoices, monthly reports, and other paperwork for inaccuracies. Performing monitoring activities as part of your day-to-day operations allows you to take a risk-based approach to handling potential areas of non-compliance before they become a bigger issue. For example, requesting and reviewing backup documentation with reimbursement requests is a good way to conduct continuous monitoring. This proactive approach can help you identify local agencies that may need a more thorough review or may be in need of additional support. We encourage you to think about subgrantee fiscal monitoring not just as a set of processes and tools that you use during site visits and desk reviews, but as a continuous and evolving framework. Within that framework, the day-to-day monitoring matters as much as the desk and on-site reviews. Through continuous effort to monitor the fiscal performance of your subgrantees, you will increase the likelihood of compliance with your LIHEAP grant and ensure high program integrity.
We realize that your approach to monitoring will differ compared to other LIHEAP grantees, and that's okay. The nature of your organization, staffing, and the design of your program all influence how you will monitor local agencies. For instance, the frequency at which you monitor subgrantees may be different than other LIHEAP grantees. Although there is no specific rule on how frequently monitoring must occur, monitoring is a requirement. Your organization may conduct annual on-site reviews of every local agency, or you may schedule reviews every 2 to 3 years, depending on your budget and the number of agencies involved. Also, in lieu of on-site fiscal reviews, you might conduct periodic desk reviews where you check agency data in a centralized database. When thinking about your monitoring approach, please keep in mind that more frequent and robust monitoring can lead to potential issues being discovered sooner. Secondly, the factors you use to determine risk will also vary based on how you design and operate your program. You may review agencies that are determined to be at a higher risk more often than others. Just a reminder that grantees with subrecipients need to be aware of 2 CFR 200.331A6B, which states that grantees must evaluate each subrecipient's risk of noncompliance for the purposes of determining appropriate subrecipient monitoring. Finally, grantees should provide local agencies who are monitored with a written report documenting observations and issues. Some grantees may choose to include in the report the agency's strengths and requirements for a corrective action plan. Some grantees may have a centralized system for tracking monitoring issues that is shared with other programs, and some grantees provide follow-up training and technical assistance to local agencies. In short, your approach is your approach. And while federal regulations indicate the requirements and the need for subgrantee fiscal monitoring, it is important to ensure that we think of subgrantee fiscal monitoring as a core element of ensuring program integrity. While your approach will be unique, ensuring that your subgrantees remain in compliance is essential.
Thanks, Audra. So to get us thinking about approaches to your subgrantee fiscal monitoring, it's helpful to know what some of the common issues of noncompliance are amongst LIHEAP grantees that we've observed through our own monitoring efforts. Hopefully, by sharing these examples, we can help you improve your own subgrantee fiscal monitoring efforts.
One issue of noncompliance that we noted during our monitoring of LIHEAP grantees occurred when subgrantee fiscal monitoring was not approached as a continuous effort and was not part of the grantee's day-to-day operations. For this grantee, the monitoring of its local agencies did not include reviewing a sample of LIHEAP transactions to ensure subawards were used for authorized purposes and in compliance with federal statutes and regulations. The grantee mentioned that due to lack of staffing, they were unable to review these transactions and that the program staff who performed subgrantee monitoring activities lacked the necessary training to perform in-depth fiscal monitoring. This lack of in-depth fiscal monitoring for LIHEAP put the grantee at an increased risk of improper use of LIHEAP funds by its subgrantees. Further, this risk was exacerbated by local agencies not being required to submit supporting documents with their monthly reimbursement requests. To address this, the grantee had to develop an implemented written monitoring plan that included procedures for reviewing supporting documents for a sample of transactions selected from each subgrantee's general ledger, and this review could take place during fiscal monitoring or when reviewing monthly reimbursement requests. And based on the results of those reviews, the grantee could then decide to review a larger sample in the future to determine whether more frequent reviews are needed to ensure that LIHEAP funds are being safeguarded.
In another example from our monitoring, we found that a grantee did not conduct any on-site monitoring of its weatherization subgrantee. Also, the grantee did not request and review supporting documentation for reimbursement requests submitted by its weatherization subgrantee. Instead, the grantee's oversight of its weatherization subgrantee was limited to a desk review of quarterly expenditure reports and end-of-year reports. Reviewing these reports was a good practice, but because that was the grantee's only method of monitoring, it was deemed inadequate. By not performing a more in-depth review of subgrantee expenditures, the grantee was unable to ensure LIHEAP funds were used for allowable purposes and in compliance with federal statutes and regulations. Also, the grantee was not reviewing the weatherization agency's subgrantees' monitoring reports and audits for potential trends or system-wide problems. There are many reasons why these monitoring shortfalls may have occurred. It could have been that the grantee thought they were doing enough, or because the weatherization program was audited as part of their annual single audit, that meant separate monitoring by the grantee was not needed. The grantee improved its monitoring process by developing an implemented written monitoring plan, which included procedures for on-site program and fiscal monitoring of the Weatherization Agency, reviewing a sample of supporting documentation for reimbursement requests submitted by the Weatherization Agency, and depending on the results of those reviews, the grantee could then decide to review a larger or smaller sample in the future and determine the frequency needed for these reviews. And procedures were developed for reviewing the Weatherization Agency's subgrantees' monitoring reports and audits.
In another example, the grantee did not conduct formal on-site fiscal monitoring of its subgrantees, including local agencies and its interagency weatherization partner. The grantee indicated that sample benefit payments were reviewed during on-site programmatic monitoring of local agencies. However, the grantee did not perform in-depth on-site fiscal monitoring. For subgrantee monitoring to be effective, it should include reviewing a sample of all types of LIHEAP transactions. This includes administrative costs, Assurance 16 costs, crisis assistance, and weatherization transactions, program costs, and benefit payments to ensure subawards are used for authorized purposes and in compliance with federal statutes and regulations. By not performing in-depth fiscal monitoring, the grantee was at increased risk of improper use of LIHEAP funds by its subgrantees. The grantee worked to improve these measures by developing and implemented written subgrantee fiscal monitoring plans, which included procedures for on-site fiscal monitoring of subgrantees, including its local agencies and weatherization interagency partner, as well as a review of a sample of all types of LIHEAP transactions.
During another monitoring site visit, we observed that there was no contractual agreement in place between the LIHEAP grantee and their interagency weatherization partner. Without this agreement in place, the grantee and the Weatherization Agency relied on informal requirements and procedures. We also observed that the grantee did not monitor the use of LIHEAP funds for weatherization. To address these issues, the grantee had to create an implemented written agreement with the Weatherization Agency that formalized requirements and responsibilities for the administration of LIHEAP weatherization. The grantee also had to develop an implemented written monitoring plan for LIHEAP weatherization that included program and fiscal monitoring of the Weatherization Agency.
In our last example, a local agency we visited was not able to provide a status update on the resolution of previous monitoring findings. The local agency explained that apart from the documentation already provided to us prior to the site visit, no other updates were available as its internal and legal representatives were still looking into this matter. The grantee who had monitored this local agency was also unable to provide a status update on the resolution of the local agency's monitoring findings. Being able to track where subgrantees are at in addressing monitoring issues is key to effective subgrantee fiscal monitoring.
Thanks, Johanna and Aja. Okay, everybody, let's take another quick poll. We want to gain a better understanding if you participated in the fiscal monitoring of your LIHEAP subgrantees. And keep in mind, you could have done this via regular reviews of subgrantee expenditures, invoices, and payments, or via formal desk reviews or site visits. And I was expecting we'd get a lot of A's for this response, and that's pretty much all we're seeing, so it's really good to know how many folks in the field have participated in subgrantee fiscal monitoring. Give you a few more minutes. Still, we've got all A's, so everybody has participated in the fiscal monitoring of their subgrantees before. Great. Thank you so much for your responses. And as you can see from the examples of noncompliance that Audra and Johanna just spoke of, it's helpful to have written plans, procedures, and processes in place regarding subgrantee fiscal monitoring. Equally important is ensuring you have entered into the proper agreements with local agencies or interagency partners who help you administer your program. In the next slides, we'll provide some ideas and considerations to help guide your subgrantee fiscal monitoring efforts. Now, these won't all match what you may be doing 100%, but these considerations and framework can help give you some insight on what must be considered when you think about your subgrantee fiscal monitoring approach. We'll start with some considerations for things to do during the pre-award period before you enter into an agreement with a local agency or interagency partner. And then we will include information about desk reviews and site visits.
As the prime recipients of LIHEAP federal dollars, you likely have a plan in place to assess your local agencies and partners prior to making sub-grant awards to them. Typically, this is done on an annual basis prior to the start of the program year. However, your process may differ. Generally, during the process of determining who gets funds and how much they should be awarded, a risk assessment is performed. This assessment helps to ensure an organization is managerially and financially capable of carrying out their subaward. A risk assessment can also help you identify and analyze relevant risks that should be managed throughout the program year, and it can also be useful in determining additional terms and conditions that should be included in a subrecipient agreement to ensure subrecipient compliance with the primary grant award. When designing a risk assessment or building a risk-based approach, consider elements such as the quality of the local agency's application, financial stability, quality of the local agency's management system, history of performance in administering the program, and audit findings. There are a number of different attributes to consider when assessing risk. The attributes used by your organization to evaluate the overall risk of subrecipients can be customized to suit your program. The following criteria may be considered: total amount of the award, staff turnover, financial management issues, programmatic noncompliance, vendor or customer complaints, and unused, unspent, or returned LIHEAP funds.
When conducting desk reviews and site visits, it is best to have a consistent approach. Desk reviews and site visits can provide an in-depth view into the operations of the local agency being monitored and can help you safeguard LIHEAP funds. Though your approach will be unique, we broke down desk reviews and site visits into the following 10 steps for your consideration. First, assess risk. To start your desk review or site visit process, it may be beneficial to prioritize who to monitor based on any pre-award conditions you may have, their past performance, and the frequency by which you monitor specific agencies. Next, notify the local agency. Ensure that you have adequately informed the local agency that they will be monitored. This can begin with a telephone call from the LIHEAP coordinator to explain the purpose of the review and arranging for a convenient date to perform the review. This could also include sending a formal notification letter with an agenda at least several weeks before the review, confirming the following: dates of the review, scope, which is what you will be doing during the review, and any documentation needed. You'll also want to communicate specifics like how long the review will last and which stakeholders or staff should be available during the review. The next step is to request documents to review. As you will likely request documents or have access to information through shared systems, review available documentation prior to the review. As you look through these materials, document your observations and use them to inform your discussions during the review.
The next step is an entrance meeting. At the start of the review, hold an entrance meeting with the appropriate local agency staff, for example, fiscal and program staff. The meeting should start with introductions, and the review's purpose, scope, and schedule should be clearly communicated to the local agency staff. The next step is to interview and observe. During this step, grantees could interview the local agency staff to learn more about their operations. These conversations should be documented in a way that makes sense for you and your objectives. It is a good practice to document your interviews and observations so that later on you can explain the basis for any findings and identify the sources of information used to arrive at your conclusions. Next, you could conduct an exit meeting. To conclude your review, hold an exit meeting with the local agency staff to present the tentative findings noted from their review. For findings discussed, there should be a clear understanding of any remaining actions the local agency should take.
The next step is to send a monitoring report or letter. A monitoring report or letter should be sent to create an official record of findings not resolved during the exit conference. You can send this report to the local agency within an established time frame after the exit conference. Any issues and recommendations should be clearly described in the report. If the local office is experiencing problems or failing to comply with federal requirements or program guidelines, this should also be mentioned. The report should include deadlines for responding as well as instructions for the local agency on how to submit their proposed resolutions to any findings. The next step is to track corrective actions. Corrective action plans describe the actions the local agency will take to remedy any issues identified in the monitoring review. Since you may be monitoring several local agencies, it is important to have a way to track corrective actions from each agency as they reply to your monitoring reports. Track issues and deadlines and when you should follow up with the local agencies if needed. The next step is to provide training and technical assistance, or TA. Using your monitoring to inform TA and training efforts can help you ensure program integrity and promote continual learning on how to improve your program. For example, if you see a lot of the same issues arising, consider addressing them in trainings offered to all of your local agencies. Or if you see a specific issue come up repeatedly at one local agency, consider providing targeted TA to that local agency. The final step is to close the process. If adequate documentation is received to resolve each finding, consider sending a closure letter to the subgrantee to officially close the monitoring process. As you follow these steps, keep the focus on continuous improvement. Look for trends in findings so that you can provide more and better TA to address common concerns.
Thank you, Johanna. So hopefully that framework and those considerations can help you think through your own monitoring approach and the areas that may work well for you to adopt for on your own. We've also seen a lot of LIHEAP grantees already do some pretty interesting and commendable practices through our monitoring, and we wanted to share them with you so you have even more ideas. One LIHEAP grantee we monitored had developed an outstanding use of internal trainings, meetings, and work groups which helped them proactively assess risks. In addition, the grantee's accounting and fiscal staff had a strong understanding of LIHEAP requirements, policies, and resources. Examples of their approach included quarterly trainings to subgrantees on fraud prevention and other key policies and procedures, and monthly trainings for the grantee's staff, which included trainings on subjects like contracts management, financial processes, and procurement requirements. He had formed a finance operations group, which met monthly for a discussion and training, and they also had an annual conference. And they had a fiscal meeting every quarter between the fiscal, program, and accounting staff to discuss key operational items such as internal reports and cash flow management.
Now let's discuss a noteworthy practice regarding communication with program staff. As we mentioned earlier on, subgrantee fiscal monitoring is not just for fiscal staff. Communication with program staff is important throughout the monitoring process. One grantee has monitors from their program staff that work closely with the finance office to discuss and receive technical assistance on fiscal areas. The information gained from the finance office helps the program monitors review fiscal items as part of their on-site subgrantee monitoring visits.
And finally, let's look at a noteworthy practice related to an interagency partnership. For those grantees that have weatherization partners, please remember that they are also responsible for monitoring their own subgrantees. In one grantee we visited, we learned that the weatherization agency's monitoring team conducts thorough on-site fiscal monitoring of its subgrantees. Their monitoring process includes a review of invoices and supporting documents and tying them to production reports, accounting systems and cash controls, accounts payable and procurement processes, and compliance with relevant policies and procedures, including verifying whether the subgrantee is compliant with its own policies and procedures related to segregation of duties, conflict of interest, etc.
All right, so hopefully from this overview of subgrantee fiscal monitoring, you've learned more about what subgrantee fiscal monitoring is and why it matters, as well as the requirements and regulations for subgrantee fiscal monitoring. We hope the considerations and framework we provided for pre-award activities, desk reviews, and site visits will be useful as you carry out your own efforts. And it's also great to learn from real examples regarding issues of non-compliance and noteworthy practices. So hopefully those added value to the conversation as well. Lastly, one more thing to mention is that when we talk about subgrantee monitoring, we often focus on issues of non-compliance, but please keep in mind that one of the big benefits of monitoring is the noteworthy or notable practices that you get to observe. Very often during our own monitoring of LIHEAP grantees, we see some really good practices that we feel other grantees could benefit from knowing about. So you've seen us share some of those notable practices in our webinars this year. So please do address any issues of non-compliance or inefficiency, but also recognize and appreciate that there are a lot of great things that you and your subgrantees are doing as well. Here are links to references we made throughout the presentation, and we've listed some additional resources that should help you with other aspects of your LIHEAP program. So just reading down the list here, we've provided links to the LIHEAP statute, other relevant federal regulations and guidance, ACF and LIHEAP terms and conditions for your LIHEAP grant award, as well as a LIHEAP IAM on OMB uniform administrative guidance. The LIHEAP Grantee Resource Guide has a lot of very helpful information for grantees, including a specific section on monitoring. The LIHEAP Clearinghouse 2 has a lot of good information on LIHEAP plans, manuals, and other administrative items, including a specific section for oversight and monitoring. And there's also the LIHEAP Virtual Library, which allows you to take a deeper dive into a range of technical assistance resources. There's also the OCS website, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It provides resources for LIHEAP grantees, including information memoranda, dear colleague notices, and training materials. So we've provided a link here. And then there's also the LIHEAP website navigator, which is a tool that should make it easier for you to look for a lot of relevant LIHEAP guidance and information. For example, on the navigator website, you could do a keyword search for the term monitoring, and relevant results will show up. All right, John, back to you.
Okay, once again, thank you, ICF, for just going through the entire webinar of subgrantee fiscal monitoring and all the relevant information involved. Just to recap some important points or to create or enhance robust fiscal monitoring. Think about the risk assessment. I know that was mentioned, and so the risk assessment process, well, a good risk assessment process will always take into account multiple factors that should be scored based on your agency's determination of importance of the factors that you've chosen. The subgrantees that have the highest scores based off the factors that have been chosen should require the highest prioritization for monitoring as well as follow-up activities. Compliance. There isn't necessary. Have you considered all the federal and statewide rules? Well, remember to include referencing your agreements with subrecipients and your monitoring tools to those agencies, all of the applicable federal rules for from LIHEAP, the statute, regulations, and the grant award terms and conditions, which are located on our ACF website. Also make